I'm Scott.
I'm Bill.
And we're the Trade Guys.
You're listening to The Trade Guys, a podcast produced by CSIS where we talk about trade in terms that everyone can understand. I'm H. Andrew Schwartz, and I'm here with Scott Miller and Bill Reinsch, the CSIS Trade Guys.
This is Trade Guy Scott. Thanks for listening to The Trade Guys. This week, we have a special episode, a book review with Alex Capri. Alex has written a book called Techno-Nationalism. He's an American writer based in Singapore. He teaches business and public policy at the National University of Singapore. There are interesting ideas here. We hope you enjoy this, and we'll talk to you next week.
Welcome, everybody. It's Trade Guys Scott and Bill today, along with a special guest that I'll introduce in just a minute. But first, another shameless plug from Scott.
Yes. Last week, we mentioned that Bill and I, once a year, do a 2.5K course on trade policy and politics. It's called Trade Policy Crash Course with the Trade Guys. It's open for enrollment now. It will be held May 8th and 9th in CSIS headquarters, Washington, D.C., or we have an online option. But if you can be there, Bill and I will spend 2.5 days starting from the beginning and going as deep as the group wants to on all the key portions of U.S. trade law, practice, and the politics. We do this with a relatively small group. We limit the size to 20, so you can ask questions, you can engage us. Lots of courses in the Washington, D.C. area. This one is done for time efficiency and to get your questions answered versus what the lecturer wants to deliver. So if that sounds like something you'd like to do, go to csis.org, Executive Education, and look for Crash Course with the Trade Guys. Bill.
Okay, sign up, everybody. It's a fun thing to do. Today, though, we have a special guest, and I want to introduce him, and then we'll have a conversation. His name is Alex Capri, and he teaches in the business school at the National University of Singapore and also in the same university's Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. He's worked extensively in China and Asia for 2 decades, where he was a partner and the regional leader of KPMG's Asia Trade and Customs practice, based in both Hong Kong and Singapore. Prior to his consulting career, he was a trade specialist in the U.S. Treasury Department and the U.S. Customs Service. He's a regular panelist for the World Economic Forum. He writes for Forbes Asia and Nikkei Asia and is a frequent guest on global television and radio networks, and also today, a guest on The Trade Guys. And the reason he's a guest on The Trade Guys is because he's written a book. And it's an important book that I want to encourage all of you to take a look at. The book is called Techno-Nationalism, and the subtitle is How It's Reshaping Trade, Geopolitics, and Society. And it's a big book, but it's got full of all kinds of good stuff, and we're going to be talking about what's inside it. Let me begin for the first question for Alex. Tell us a little bit about the book, but tell us, what is techno-nationalism and why does it matter?
First of all, thanks for having me on The Trade Guys. I really appreciate it. So techno-nationalism has been around for centuries. As long as there have been nation states, techno-nationalism has driven state behavior. So essentially, it's the linkage of technological prowess to a nation's national security, economic strength and stability, and now in the 21st century, because of the technologies all around us, social stability. So it's how governments look to promote their own not just national champions, but their own sectors, their own resilient supply chains, how they look to push what I call the 6 core elements of techno-nationalism. And these are important elements because we see these playing out all around us. So the first one is essentially weaponization of strategic supply chains. So the use of export controls, the use of sanctions, now increasingly the use of what I think we're going to see more of in the future, outbound investment, tracing where it's going and for what purpose. Obviously, we've been seeing restrictions on acquisitions and partnerships. So that's the first element. Second element is a direct result of the first, which is strategic decoupling of supply chains and de-risking. The third element is, again, a result of the first two, and that is this move towards reshoring or attempts to reshore strategic industries, nearshore them, ring-fence them, if you will. The fourth is what has been referred to in some quarters as innovation mercantilism, or more simply, innovation-driven industrial policy, active participation of governments in the promotion of strategic technologies. After that, we have trade diplomacy. How do governments engage with other governments to promote their own techno-nationalist agendas, collectively, jointly, etc.? That involves public-private partnerships as well. And then finally, the final element is really more of a broader existential phenomenon, and that is this hybrid Cold War environment that is sort of ubiquitous, right? It's everywhere. It's fused into our commercial activities day to day.
Say a little bit then, bring it into the present day, because we're recording this on Tariff Liberation Day, as it happens, before the announcement, so we can't predict what's going to happen. But we clearly have a president who is focused on major changes in the trading system. How does techno-nationalism impact Trump 2.0, or the other way around? How is Trump going to affect what you've just been talking about?
Yeah, so I think Trump 2.0 is having, well, surprise, surprise, what really is an unpredictable and very sort of ad hoc transactional kind of effect on those 6 elements that I talked about. Where I see Trump 2.0 departing from the Biden administration, which I think had a very methodical approach to its own, small yard, high fence approach to techno-nationalism and the way it was using the different tools in the toolbox. I think Trump calls into question the elements of techno-diplomacy, right? How will the U.S. engage with its historic allies around achieving strategic supply chain resilience, for example, around critical minerals and rare earths, or around enforcing export controls around semiconductor controls, AI diffusion rules, and so on. So I think given the nature of this current president and, how, he doesn't seem to have any issues or any problems with isolating or alienating our strategic allies, I think that's a close area to watch. I think the other area, as you mentioned, Bill, we're here on this really historic day regarding tariffs. And that is, what's the linkage between the use of tariffs as a coercive tool, for example, the use of tariffs to extract concessions around, for example, behavior around maybe AI diffusion, and whether a second-tier country like Malaysia or Singapore moves aggressively to prevent the transshipment of NVIDIA chips or to enforce other kinds of restrictions and controls against Chinese interests. I think tariffs now become yet another tool that the Trump administration could potentially use.
Scott?
Yeah, Alex, I'd like to start at the other end of this innovation story, which is the basic idea. And I'm a hobbyist when it comes to these kinds of things. But as I look at the world, our modern life is more and more dependent on invention. Innovation is what sustains economies, it's what sustains most of modern life. And at the same time, we're not very good at identifying what it takes to get more. Everybody will say innovation is really important and inventions really matter. And when you ask them, okay, so what exactly do you do that would get more? And how do you know? I get a lot of blank stares. As you researched this book and looked at a broad range of government policies, it's probably easier to find ones how you restrain innovation. But does anybody really know how to use the tools of government to get more innovation?
Yeah, that's a great question, Scott. Look, I think I refer to the so-called technology feedback loop throughout history, right? That has produced a kind of network effect, if you will, around innovation, technological innovation. And I find that there's a grab bag of different kinds of dynamics that all have to come together. So the feedback loop, when we talk about techno-nationalism, the feedback loop is the defense establishment, it's academia and research institutions leading edge, it's the private sector, it's specific companies within the niche industries, and there are actually 12 what I call power multiplier technologies that I think really form the core techno-nationalist sort of imperative, if you will. And then continuing in the feedback loop, you have government itself, right? You have enlightened government, or you have government that provides funding, that becomes a catalyst, that maybe provides for the long-term blue sky research, general research, as well as very specific research. You have the necessity of government to come up with that kind of money that the private sector won't do. And now, of course, in today's environment, you have the startups, right? You have the small, really, really lean, but really, really powerful tech startups and niche players that are, of course, leveraging AI and leveraging, computing power and high connectivity. So I think there's a really important balance. There's a sweet spot that involves finding the entrepreneurial space as well as the public funding and the public catalyst space that within that feedback loop can push the envelope. I think we can talk a little bit later, hopefully, about open sourcing, right? And the DeepSeek effect and what I think that does or doesn't do to this whole techno-nationalist landscape.
Going into the book for a minute, you did a really convenient thing for podcasters like this. You posed a list of big questions and didn't promise to answer them, which was probably wise on your part. But they are big questions and they're important ones. And I want to ask you a couple of them. And you can draw from the book or anything else you want and give us some guidance. Scott's at 40,000 meters here, and I'm going to descend down to maybe 5,000 with a couple more specific questions. But they're ones that are, I think, operationally important right now. And the first one concerns the U.S.-China relationship, because one of the things we've talked about frequently on the podcast is it's hard to have a conversation these days about trade without it being about national security and without it being about China. And so this is something that we're dealing with, and you've already referenced this a couple times. So what do you see going forward, not just in the immediate short term, but sort of medium, longer term, about the U.S.-China relationship? Can we achieve competitive coexistence, which I think is one of your terms, and can we continue to engage in trade, where we already are heavily trading with each other, not on an equal basis, but there's an awful lot of trade. We are entangled. Or are we going to be moving into a period of substantially more decoupling?
One of the things that I try to stress throughout the book is this notion of not just the paradigm shift that's occurred in the West, right? When it comes to, this move from trade liberalization to a much more controlled trade environment, and particularly when it comes to China, but also the prevalence of paradox, right? So paradox is all around us in the international trading system. And when it comes to the U.S.-China relationship, what I think is going to happen here is we have to be very specific when we look at where decoupling is going to happen. We're going to see continued decoupling, and that is around the 12 strategic power multiplier technologies. So I'll list.
Yeah, what are those?
I won't go through all of them, but essentially it would be, obviously semiconductors, anything to do with AI, and that would be, machine learning, cognitive AI, large language models, computing power, quantum, things like biotech, hypersonic sciences, advanced materials, advanced manufacturing, sensing and timing equipment, obviously aerospace. I spent a lot of time in the book talking about the new space race and the new kind of competition in space. Data centers, those types of things, right? So those are the strategic technologies that are foundational, they're core to techno-nationalism, to those core elements of techno-nationalism that I mentioned. So I think we will see a very clear bifurcation in those technology stacks and a very clear bifurcation of those supply chains. But I think in other areas, more innocuous areas, I think we could actually see potentially an increase in trade volumes, right? I mean, types of consumer goods, possibly even some types of consumer electronics, particularly as China expands its legacy chip production and capabilities. But in the middle, and this is what I refer to as the gray zone, in the middle, within this entangled landscape of supply chains, you have a gray area, or what I call the gray zone, the dual use gray zone. And the dual use gray zone is essentially extensively traded commercial technologies that potentially could be used for military purposes, hence the term dual use. And depending on how the relationship either degrades or, manages to achieve competitive coexistence, that gray zone, that dual use gray zone is sort of a shrinking, kind of an amorphous kind of area, right? That there's a lot of uncertainty in that. So I think that's where the thinkers, the advisors, the people that manage companies as well as policymakers, they're going to really have to figure out how to get a handle on that risk and those types of overnight kind of events or occurrences that could impact the gray zone.
Is it shrinking or growing? I would argue it's growing.
Absolutely. It's growing in that every time a new technology is introduced, or as more export controls are added and more companies are added to the entity lists, That gray zone is growing.
A lot of the discussions around these topics come in the flavor of de-risking. Everybody wants to de-risk their supply chains, or de-risk something. It strikes me that de-risking is a very basic human action. We do it all the time. If you and I are going to settle a transaction, we'll decide on the currency in which it settles and the legal terms where the contract would be arbitrated. So we'll use New York rules and US dollars. That action by itself is de-risking. Almost all of us do that as human endeavor. And a lot of it gets done voluntarily and quite out of sight. Remember, Fred Smith of FedEx was a pilot, and he said a lot of aviation rules are neither not written down or subject to no agreement, like the numbers on the end of runways. But they're consistent worldwide. The numbers that are painted on the runway mean the same thing, and every pilot knows what they mean, and they use them, and nobody made a rule about it. It just is. And so how much of de-risking is just normal risk management that any reasonable operator would do? And how much of it is unique to this modern moment based on what you've seen?
Yeah. And I think that's an important distinction. So de-risking of supply chains, for example, would involve stuff that we would do with or without geopolitical competition, without the US-China situation. And that would be simply avoiding single source supply chains, right? Avoiding choke point issues, diversifying supply chains, having multiple suppliers, having fallback suppliers, et cetera. Stockpiling when necessary. Decoupling, on the other hand, especially if it's decoupling that is driven by techno-nationalist results or techno-nationalist motives, that is a clear severing of a relationship or a supply chain because of the very specific risk of export controls, of sanctions, of sort of aggressive, if you will, actions by a government to basically choke off access to a technology.
And what's the cost of that if you do that in today's integrated economy? It's not free, I assume.
No, absolutely not. And of course, somebody my age who's witnessed and benefited from, 3 decades of hyper globalization, right? Started my career as a customs officer and watched the offshoring phenomenon. And that occurred at the same time that there was a revolution in communication and computing power, and all these great things happened. Now, of course, we have a geoeconomic imperative, right? So the whole idea of just in time shifting to just in case. And that means that there are absolutely going to be costs involved. There will be lack of efficiencies or less efficiencies in less rationalized supply chains. And especially when we're talking about things like trying to move manufacturing bases back to the United States, this is not something that happens quickly. This is not something that happens inexpensively. Of course, there are economies of scale that are lost. There are redundancies that are gained. But again, geoeconomically, while we continue to pursue profit, we continue to pursue efficiencies, the geoeconomic side or the techno-nationalist side basically is going to impose new costs and new limitations.
Well, we've talked about that many times here. I agree with you. We're inserting into what used to be an economic equation non-economic variables like resilience. And you're also telling companies or encouraging companies to change. Just changing costs money, whether you're changing to something better or something worse. The fact of changing costs money. And because you are inserting, as I said, non-economic variables, what you're going to get is a less efficient outcome, which means higher prices and suboptimal outcomes. But that seems to be the way we're going. I guess the big question is the Biden administration attempted to deal with this. And initially they said, we can do all that and it won't cost anybody anything. So many people pointed out that just was so profoundly stupid that they then changed their argument and said, well, yeah, it will impose costs, but there are these security-related benefits that are more important. How do you weigh that? Where do we come out on that? Are the security advantages or benefits that we get important enough to go for a less efficient outcome?
Look, I think if it's directly related to national security, if it's an economic security issue, or if it somehow reduces too much dependency, right, and too much risk on, as I mentioned, single source type scenarios. The typical example of that we see playing out right now is advanced semiconductors. If we continue to have a situation where basically one company, TSMC, and one country, Taiwan, is producing 80 to 90% of the world's most, producing as in fab, right? Fabricating 80 to 90% of the world's most advanced chips, that's just not a sustainable situation, right? That's not going to work. Now, from a trade liberalization standpoint, from a neoliberal sort of economic standpoint, who cares, right? It worked out perfectly, right? The value chain segmented nicely. It turned out that TSMC was the perfect subcontractor. It was the perfect niche. Obviously, that's not the world that we live in, and that's not the world where we're going. So I think we're going to have to see these types of situations work themselves out, which is going to take probably a decade, right? A long time for this sort of stuff to work out. And again, this should happen, in my opinion, this should and will happen only around the most strategic technologies, right? That again come down to core security issues, both national and economic.
Yeah, but what are those and how do you decide?
Any kind of technology that is going to be ultimately defense related, that is going to provide a backbone for commercial activities, that could, if it was restricted or if it was somehow sabotaged, if you will, could have profound effects on the markets, on day trading, but also on supply chains. And, then of course there's technology around energy security. There's technology around food security. There's certainly technology around logistics and supply chains. And what I do focus on more than anything else in the book, or I keep coming back to this central theme, is the semiconductor AI nexus, right? So anything that threatens the semiconductor AI nexus, the use of those two very, very critical foundational technologies, those I think have to be carefully thought about, carefully managed from a techno-nationalist standpoint.
It strikes me that part of the solution to, even when you have a very sophisticated company at the leading edge and no one else close, that investment's part of the solution. In other words, TSMC is building plants in the United States. They don't have to have all their fabs in Taiwan. The dangerous concentration would be one company with all its facilities in a single place. And so investment can deal with that. But what about the rest of the critical elements in these production chains? I'm struck by the fact that I'm glad we don't call them rare earths anymore, that we call them strategic materials or minerals. But we have roughly the same share of the Earth's crust that China has. We have a U.S. Geological Survey that can tell us where all these minerals are located in our share of the Earth's crust. The technology of mining and refining metals and so-called rare earths is well known, but we don't do it. It's like we don't want to. What do we do in that situation where there's a straightforward solution? It's a nationalist solution that we just don't want to take.
Well, I think, Scott, going back to the paradigm shift that I mentioned, and this shift to a geoeconomic imperative, if you will, this is the result, again, of decades of commerce, right? And decades of investment and commercial decisions. And the world has changed, right? We've moved on from Cold War I and the unipolar moment, and we've encountered the situation where we are today, where we have a rising superpower that has different geopolitical ambitions and is obviously imposing a challenge in the international system. So all of this is the result of really, historically, I think when one looks at techno-nationalism through the centuries, the last 3 to 4 decades have been an historic anomaly, right? We've had this confluence of very serendipitous events that all occurred at one time that allowed us to enjoy these last 4 decades, really. But that's over with now, right? So we still have the benefits of technology for productivity growth and for economic growth, but we have the geopolitical element now that has completely transformed the international landscape. And I should mention that the other elements of the book, I talked about the elements of techno-nationalism. There are existential reactions to this, which I refer to as the Great Reorganization. I don't see the world deglobalizing. I see it reorganizing along the lines that we've discussed and bifurcating along the lines that we discussed. But even amongst that reorganization process, so that restructuring process, there's economic growth there. There's profit to be made. There are problems to be solved. So I think, Scott, getting back to your question about critical minerals, essentially, you're right. They're not that rare. But, setting up the capacity to extract and process those minerals is a very expensive and a very, very long-term process. And it was under the trade liberalization model and the trade liberalization thinking that we've all embraced, myself included, where we offshored all of that stuff, right? The US was the number one processor and extractor of rare earths 40 years ago. The Mountain Pass mine in California was by far the largest rare earth production facility. And they offshored all that to China. And China saw that. Deng Xiaoping had the vision to see the importance of critical minerals and critical mineral processing 4 decades ago, right? And that was already in their long-term vision and their long-term plan of industrial policy.
I want to relate that, to go back to chips, because I'm puzzling over the question of what's the most important element in the process. When it comes to advanced chips, the Biden administration approach, the CHIPS Act approach, was let's make it here. Let's get the production here. Who makes it was of secondary importance. So TSMC is building fab plants in Arizona. So that means that TSMC still has the technology. TSMC is still making the chips. They're going to make them here. They're also going to make them in Taiwan and other places, but they're just going to make them here. That doesn't mean that we now have that technology. We don't. They do. Mm-hmm. But they have it here. Does that matter? Is it just a question of where?
It matters where and how the supply chain ecosystem is structured so that it is somewhat insulated and somewhat ring-fenced. So I think it's not just about TSMC coming and doing the fab here, but it's about the second and the third level suppliers, the chemical companies. It's about the synergies, right, that exist. It's about getting the talent and the talent pool, the talent pipeline to be produced locally, which is happening, right? Purdue University, Arizona State University, and a whole collection of other schools that are involved in these micro electronic type hubs.
Yeah, but is that really happening? We're turning away so many foreign students.
Well, are
we going to pay a price for that?
That's another matter entirely. It's where do we get the talent from if we can't get the best and the brightest from around the world? And that is absolutely an issue that's going to have to be addressed. And I actually address that in my chapter on techno-nationalism on campus and the chip schools chapter. But the way that's happening now is you have, well, this started with the Biden administration, right? Couldn't tell you what's going to happen under the Trump administration, but I suspect this will continue. And what we were seeing under the Biden administration was a kind of friend-shoring effect amongst the universities and private companies and governments amongst the chip value chain countries, if you will. So Japan, Japanese universities with American universities, Taiwanese universities, American universities, European universities, but also Indian universities, and a focus on developing pipelines between Indian institutions of higher learning, STEM-related institutions, and American and other critical universities. So I think that is a very strategic kind of friend-shoring approach to producing the right kind of ecosystems around the value chains. But that, again, I think is a network effect, right? That has to involve all of the key players, from government to corporations, and increasingly organizations like DARPA, defense-driven organizations. I think that is critical, and we're going to see more of that.
Yeah, that cooperation happened at the local level, too. I know CHIPS, there was an investment in Columbus, Ohio, I believe from Intel, with the CHIPS and Jobs Act. And Ohio State University's engineering department and many other universities in the central Ohio region were involved in discussions and will be providing the talent to operate that facility. So this happens at a lot of levels and could be a very helpful way to build talent here that we've offshored as well for the last few decades. Alex, you got a 500-page book here, and we have a 30-minute podcast, so there's going to be a limit to how much we can talk about. But what would you like to say to the potential reader, and how would you like to wrap up? We'll give you an opportunity to sell your book if you'd like. But
before we do that, I've got one more question, too. Yeah. So go ahead and answer, Scott, but I've got one after that.
I did try and come at this with a fairly methodical approach, with sort of the framework of analysis, sort of the underlying themes of those 12 power multiplier technologies, and then the existential effects of techno-nationalism around the reorganization of the global economy, the bifurcation of the economy, the gray zone, the state-firm tensions that need to be navigated going through, as technology companies and strategic companies become assets, right, in this U.S.-China geopolitical competition, and also become targets, seen as proxies of various states. So the approach there was how to navigate through. And of course, we didn't get into any of the discussion around climate change and techno-nationalism and clean tech and the effects of techno-nationalism on clean tech. But I think the linkage to energy and infrastructure, energy infrastructure and other types of critical infrastructure, understanding that linkage, I think, is very important when scenario mapping, when trying to figure out where your risks are as a corporation, as an investor, for example.
Yeah.
These are important themes.
Great point. And it's clear from the modern world that if you don't get your energy policy right, you can't have nice things. So that's a critical element. But last question is Bill's.
Yeah, let me shift gears for a second. It seems to me in looking at this that there's more than one gray zone. There's the gray zone that you talked about, but there's also the geopolitical gray zone. There's the U.S. and there's China, which is what we've been talking about. And then there's everybody else, which is a whole bunch of countries trying to stay in the middle, out of the fray. What's your prognosis for them?
I think DeepSeek, the recent announcement by DeepSeek, I think is worth noting here, because when the Biden administration attempted, I don't think it's actually been fully ratified, but in terms of dividing the world into 3 tiers around technology access to AI, the trusted U.S. partners, then the middle tier countries, which is the majority of the world, and then, of course, the so-called pariah states, right, when it comes to accessing that technology. I think the issue for all those middle tier countries is, can they avoid a binary choice, right? Can they avoid having to choose sides for who builds their technology stack, who provides the critical technology in their technology stack, right? Is there something that can increase their agency? And one of the areas, potentially, and this is where DeepSeek comes in, is whether or not open sourced technology and infrastructure lowers the barriers to entry around AI and then therefore potentially around other leading edge technologies and niches. And secondly, can that leading edge AI be built with legacy chips as opposed to advanced chips, right? So right now, the US, of course, continues to exert a chokehold on the really critical aspects of the value chain around advanced chips, right? So obviously, extreme ultraviolet technology, exert pressure on the Dutch government and ASML, the company that makes that, but also being able to control American companies like Applied Materials and Lam and others around the use of metrology equipment and etching equipment, et cetera. So as long as that advantage exists through, again, those choke points, as long as the most advanced chips are required for by far the most advanced kinds of AI and other kinds of technology, the US will continue to have great leverage. And that means that countries in the middle are going to have to make choices, right? They're going to have to choose sides around who builds their data centers, who builds their cloud, who builds their cloud computing, that sort of thing, who builds their undersea cables. But if we do have a situation where legacy chips can drive more and more innovation and more commercial activity, then I think the middle countries have more agency, right? And this is where DeepSeek comes in. DeepSeek, I don't think is going to be as big of a game changer as people thought, because I do think that NVIDIA's most advanced chips, or whoever ends up making those chips in the future, those chips are going to continue to be very, very important in specific sectors, in defense, in aerospace, in autonomous vehicles, in other areas. So I think the legacy versus the advanced chip scenario, I think, is very important to watch, Bill.
Well, what that means is that in the construction of all that infrastructure, we're not the only salesman.
Right.
And countries, you're right, countries will have to make choices. But it also means that this gets back to me, the fundamental difference between Biden and Trump on stuff like this, which is carrots and sticks. We have to have a pitch. The Biden pitch tended to be carrots. The Trump pitch, as we'll see probably this afternoon, tends to be sticks. We'll see which one ends up being the better strategy for the longer term.
Or a little of both. We'll see if that works out.
The truth is usually somewhere in the middle. Anyway, that's all the time we have, but let me go back to the title, Techno-Nationalism. I'm holding it up, not that any of you can see it, but Techno-Nationalism, How It's Reshaping Trade, Geopolitics, and Society. Get it at your bookstore, get it at Amazon or any other place that does that sort of thing. I think it's a good read. It'll make you think. And thank you, Alex, for joining us.
Thank you so much, Bill and Scott.
Thanks for being here.
To our listeners, if you have a question for the Trade Guys, write us at tradeguys@csis.org. That's tradeguys@csis.org. we'll read some of your emails and have the Trade Guys react to it. You've been listening to The Trade Guys, a CSIS podcast.